Welcome to the Heartbeat Podcast, your trusted source for the latest breakthroughs and insights in cardiology. Here, we uncover the science behind every beat, bringing you cutting-edge research, expert discussions, and innovative approaches to heart health. Whether you're a medical professional, a curious learner, or someone passionate about understanding the heart's complexities, you're in the right place. So let's dive into today's episode and explore the pulse of modern cardiology together.
Welcome back, everyone. Today's deep dive is all about MRAs, Mineralocorticoid Receptor Antagonists.
Wow, what a mouthful.
I know, right? But don't worry, we'll break it all down for you. Basically, we're going to be looking at how these MRAs affect people with heart failure.
And it turns out that not all heart failure is the same, which is where things get really interesting.
Exactly. So you sent over a bunch of research for this deep dive for big clinical trials to start with. Rails Emphasis HF TopCat.
And the more recent Fine Arts HF trial.
Right. Which actually focused on a newer type of MRA. And then to tie it all together, we've got that huge meta-analysis that was just published in The Lancet last month.
Yeah, that meta-analysis really gave us some powerful insights.
Okay, so before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start with the basics. All of these studies are looking at how MRAs can help people with heart failure.
But the big question they're trying to answer is, does the type of heart failure you have actually change how well these drugs work?
So that's where this whole ejection fraction thing comes in.
You got it. Ejection fraction is kind of like the key to understanding the different types of heart failure.
Okay, so can you give us a quick refresher? What exactly is ejection fraction?
Sure. Think of your heart like a pump, right? Every time it beats, it squeezes out blood to the rest of your body. Ejection fraction is simply the percentage of blood that gets pumped out with each beat.
So like how efficient your heart is at doing its job.
Precisely. Now, a healthy heart pumps out a good amount of blood with each squeeze. But when someone has heart failure, that pump isn't working as well.
And that's where those different classifications come in HFR-EF, HFMR-EF, and HFP-EF. I always have to look those up.
Haha. I know they're a mouthful, but they're actually pretty simple once you break them down. So HFR-EF, that stands for heart failure with reduced ejection fraction.
Meaning the heart is weak and not pumping out enough blood.
Exactly. Then you've got HFMR-EF, heart failure with mildly reduced ejection fraction. So in this case, the heart is still pumping, but not quite as strongly as it should be.
Okay, so both of those are about how well the heart is pumping. But HFP-EF is different, right?
Right. HFP-EF stands for heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. Now, this might sound counterintuitive, but in this case, the problem isn't so much with the pumping action itself. The problem is that the heart muscle is stiff. It doesn't relax properly between beats, so it's harder for the heart to fill up with blood.
Ah, I see. It's not that the pump is broken, it's that the container isn't filling up properly.
You got it. And this difference between a pump problem and a filling problem is really important because it seems to influence how MRAs work in each type of heart failure.
Okay, so let's get to the good stuff. What did these studies actually find? And maybe we can start with the steroidal MRAs like spironolactone and eplerenone. What did those trials show?
Well, for patients with HFR-EF, so that weak pump problem, the steroidal MRAs were really impressive.
In what way? What kind of improvements did they see?
Well, the big thing is that they significantly reduced the risk of people either dying from heart-related causes or ending up back in the hospital because their heart failure was getting worse.
So basically, they were helping people live longer and stay out of the hospital.
Exactly. A win-win situation for sure. But then you have the non-steroidal MRAs, and that's where things get even more interesting.
Yeah, because we mentioned that newer trial, Fine Arts HF, which specifically looked at the non-steroidal MRA phenomenon. And I know that one was focusing on HFMR-EF and HFP-EF.
Right. And the results for Finernon were actually very similar to what we saw with the steroidal MRAs, but specifically in those patients with HFMR-EF or HFP-EF.
So it seems like maybe the type of MRA that works best might actually depend on the type of heart failure you have.
It's looking that way. And that's a big deal because it could change how doctors approach treatment for these different types of heart failure.
Okay, but how big of a difference are we actually talking about here? Because researchers love their statistics.
They do.
Yeah.
And they often talk about things like hazard ratios, which can sound kind of confusing.
Yeah, I was definitely scratching my head over those. Can you translate that into plain English for us? What do those numbers actually mean for the average person?
Absolutely. So let's start with the steroidal MRAs for people with HFR-EF. Taking those medications reduced their risk of dying from heart problems or being hospitalized for worsening heart failure by a whopping 34%.
Wow, 34%. That's huge. What about fine or none for those with HFMREF or HFpEF?
For them, fine or none lowered that same combined risk by about 13%.
Yeah.
Not quite as dramatic, but still a significant improvement.
Definitely. And I think it's worth pointing out that for a long time, there weren't a lot of great treatments for HFMREF and HFpEF. So finding something that makes even a 13% difference is a pretty big deal.
Absolutely. And, this is actually the first time a non-steroidal MRA has shown such clear benefits in those specific types of heart failure. So it's a really exciting development.
So it seems like we're starting to get a clearer picture of which MRAs work best for which type of heart failure. But were there any surprises in the research? Anything that the researchers weren't expecting to find?
There was one finding that was kind of unexpected. While MRAs clearly reduce the risk of cardiovascular death or hospitalization for heart failure, they didn't significantly reduce cardiovascular death alone in those with HFMREF or HFpEF.
That's interesting. Why would that be?
Well, when the researchers looked into it further, they found that in those patients with HFMREF or HFpEF, a larger proportion of the deaths were actually due to things other than heart problems.
Like what?
Things like infections, cancer, other chronic illnesses. Basically things that an MRA, which is primarily targeting the heart, wouldn't necessarily prevent.
That makes sense. It's not that the MRAs weren't working, it's just that they weren't designed to address those other causes of death.
Exactly. But even though MRAs might not be a magic bullet against every possible health threat, they still offer significant benefits for people with heart failure. And I think it's important to emphasize that across all the types of heart failure, MRAs consistently help people stay out of the hospital.
Right. Because avoiding hospitalizations is a big deal. It means better quality of life for the patient, and it's better for the healthcare system as a whole.
Couldn't agree more. Less time in the hospital means more time enjoying life.
Okay, so we've talked about all the potential benefits of MRAs, but of course, no medication is completely without risk.
That's true. And MRAs do come with some potential side effects that we need to discuss.
Okay, so let's talk safety. What are some of the things people should be aware of?
Well, the main concern with MRAs is something called hyperkalemia. Basically, that just means having too much potassium in your blood.
Okay, I've heard of that before, but why is it a problem?
Well, potassium is an essential mineral. It plays a role in lots of important bodily functions like muscle contractions, including your heartbeat. But if you have too much potassium in your blood, it can actually mess with your heart rhythm, and that could be dangerous.
So how do MRAs factor into all of this?
The meta-analysis showed that people taking MRAs had about double the risk of developing hyperkalemia compared to those who weren't taking them.
Double the risk. That sounds a little scary, to be honest.
I understand the concern, but it's important to put that into perspective. While the relative risk was doubled, the absolute risk of developing severe hyperkalemia remained pretty low, around 3%.
Okay, so while it's definitely something to be aware of, it's not necessarily a reason to completely avoid MRAs.
Right. It's all about weighing the potential benefits against the risks. And this really highlights how important it is for doctors to monitor their patients who are taking MRAs. Regular blood tests can check potassium levels, and if they start to get too high, there are things doctors can do to manage it.
Are there any other side effects people should know about?
There are a few others, like declines in kidney function and low blood pressure, but these were generally manageable in the studies.
So it sounds like the bottom line is that while MRAs do have some potential risks, those risks are generally low and can be managed with careful monitoring by a doctor.
I think that's a fair assessment. Like any medication, it's about finding the right balance for each patient.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already. Different types of heart failure, how MRAs work, their potential benefits, and the safety considerations.
It's a lot to take in.
But there's still more to explore. We haven't even talked about how all of these findings hold up across different patient subgroups. Like, do the benefits remain consistent regardless of age, other health conditions, or other medications someone might be taking?
Those are great questions. And that's what we'll be diving into right after the break. Stay tuned.
All right, welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about how MRAs can be really helpful for people with heart failure.
And how the benefits might actually differ a bit depending on what type of heart failure you have.
Right. But everyone's different. We've got folks of all ages, different health histories.
Absolutely. And that's a really important point because the big question is, do these benefits of MRAs that we've been talking about, do they apply to all heart failure patients?
That's what I was thinking. Like, what about those individual factors? How did the researchers take that into account in this meta-analysis?
Well, they did something called a subgroup analysis.
Subgroup analysis. Sounds fancy.
It's not as complicated as it sounds. Basically, they just looked at smaller groups of patients within those larger trials to see if there were any differences in how well the MRAs worked.
Okay, I'm following you. So what kinds of subgroups are we talking about here?
They looked at all sorts of things: age, sex, race, body mass index, kidney function, whether people had diabetes, a history of heart attack, atrial fibrillation, you name it.
So they really tried to cover all their bases. And what did they find? Did the benefits hold up across the board?
The results were pretty amazing, actually. The benefits were surprisingly consistent across all those different subgroups.
So basically, no matter who you are or what your medical history looks like, if you have heart failure, chances are you could still benefit from MRAs.
That's what the data suggests. Of course, everyone responds to medication a bit differently, and there are always exceptions.
Of course. But it's still really encouraging to see those consistent results across so many different groups of people.
It is. It really strengthens the argument for considering MRAs as a potential treatment option for a wider range of heart failure patients.
There was one subgroup in particular that I was curious about. I know that kidney problems are pretty common in people with heart failure.
Very common.
And I know that your kidneys play a big role in how your body processes certain medications. So I was wondering if the researchers looked at how well MRAs worked in people who also had some degree of kidney issues.
It's a great question, and it's definitely something that doctors and patients need to consider. And yes, the researchers did look at that specific subgroup. And the good news is that the benefits of MRAs held up even in those patients.
That is good news. A lot of people are going to be relieved to hear that.
Absolutely. It means that even people with reduced kidney function who might not be eligible for some other treatment options could still potentially benefit from MRAs.
So it really broadens the potential reach of these medications.
Exactly. It's all about expanding options and giving people hope.
Okay, so we've gone through a lot of details about MRAs. Different types of heart failure, how they work, the potential benefits for various subgroups. I think our listeners' heads might be spinning a bit right now.
I wouldn't be surprised.
So let's bring it back to the big picture. What's the main takeaway message that we want our listeners to walk away with today? What does all this research mean for someone who's living with heart failure?
I think the key message is this. This meta-analysis adds even more weight to the evidence that MRAs can be a really effective treatment for heart failure. And what's especially encouraging is that those benefits seem to extend across different types of heart failure and a wide range of patient characteristics.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. It's really about personalized care and finding the right treatment for each individual.
Exactly. Because every patient's journey is unique.
This research is so exciting. But like you said earlier, every answer usually leads to more questions.
That's how science works. It's a never-ending quest for knowledge.
So thinking about the future of heart failure treatment, what are some of the big questions that researchers are still trying to figure out? What are the next frontiers that we need to explore?
Well, one area that I'm particularly excited about is personalized medicine.
We touched on that a bit earlier.
Right. But we're just scratching the surface. Imagine being able to use specific markers or even a person's genetic information to predict not just if they'll benefit from an MRA, but also what the best type and dose would be for them as an individual.
Wow. So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, we could really tailor the treatment to each patient's unique needs.
Exactly. It's about getting the right drug to the right person at the right time. And that's the ultimate goal of personalized medicine.
And that kind of thinking could be applied to so many other diseases as well.
It could revolutionize healthcare as we know it. And it's something that researchers are actively working on right now.
So what should our listeners keep an eye out for? What are some of the key developments that you think are going to shape the future of heart failure treatment?
One area to watch closely is the development of new biomarkers.
Biomarkers?
Yeah, these are basically measurable things in your blood or tissues that can give doctors clues about what's going on in your body.
So we're talking about things that can help doctors diagnose heart failure earlier or even predict who's at higher risk of developing it in the first place.
Exactly. Early detection and prevention are going to be key in the fight against heart failure. And biomarkers are going to play a big role in that.
What else is on the horizon? Are there any other exciting developments that you're particularly hopeful about?
Well, gene therapy is another area that has a lot of potential. Scientists are actually exploring ways to modify the genes that contribute to heart failure.
Whoa, gene therapy? That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie.
I know, but it's rapidly becoming a reality. And some researchers believe that gene therapy could one day hold the key to actually reversing or even curing heart failure.
That's incredible. It really gives you hope for the future.
It does. And the pace of discovery is just accelerating. It's an incredibly exciting time to be involved in heart failure research.
Well, this has been an amazing deep dive. I feel like we've covered so much ground from the basics of heart failure all the way to cutting-edge research and the future of personalized medicine.
It has been a fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
I hope it's left our listeners feeling informed, empowered.
Absolutely. Because knowledge is power. And when it comes to your health, the more you know, the better equipped you are to make informed decisions.
I couldn't agree more. So stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking questions. And if you're living with heart failure, know that you're not alone. There are incredible researchers and healthcare professionals who are dedicated to finding new and better ways to treat this condition.
Beautifully said. And maybe one of our listeners today will be inspired to join the fight and become the next heart failure research superstar. That's all the time we have for today, but keep diving deep. Okay, so we've talked a lot about MRAs and how they work for different types of heart failure.
And we've seen some really promising results, especially from that recent meta-analysis.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about that whole personalized medicine thing that you mentioned earlier. It's kind of mind-blowing.
I know. It's really the future of medicine, isn't it? Tailoring treatments to the individual rather than just using a one-size-fits-all approach.
Imagine a world where we could use your genes or specific biomarkers to predict exactly which MRA would work best for you and what the perfect dosage would be.
It would be amazing. No more guesswork, just targeted therapies based on your unique biology.
And like you said before, that kind of thinking could really transform how we treat all sorts of diseases.
Absolutely. It's about optimizing treatment for every patient.
So for our listeners out there who are maybe geeking out about this stuff as much as we are, what are some of the things they should keep an eye on in the coming years? What are the big developments that you think are going to shape the future of heart failure treatment?
Well, one area that's really exciting is the development of new biomarkers.
Biomarkers. Remind me what those are again.
Oh, sure. So biomarkers are basically measurable indicators in your blood or tissues that can give doctors clues about what's going on inside your body.
So like a red flag that something might be wrong.
Yeah, kind of. And when it comes to heart failure, biomarkers could help doctors diagnose the condition earlier or even identify people who are at high risk of developing it in the future.
So it's all about early detection and prevention.
Exactly. Catching things early is always better than trying to play catch up later on.
What else is on the horizon? Any other promising areas of research that have you particularly excited?
Oh, there's so much happening. It's hard to choose. But gene therapy is another area that I think has a lot of potential for heart failure.
Gene therapy? That sounds pretty futuristic.
It does, doesn't it? But it's becoming more and more of a reality. And for heart failure, researchers are looking at ways to actually modify the genes that contribute to the disease.
Wait, so they could potentially reverse or even cure heart failure by changing your genes?
Potentially. It's still early days for this kind of research, but the possibilities are incredible.
It really makes you appreciate the power of science.
It does. The human ingenuity is amazing. And the best part is that we're learning more and more every day.
This has been an amazing deep dive. We've covered so much ground.
We have.
I always feel like I learned so much from these conversations.
Me too. It's great to be able to share this knowledge with our listeners.
Absolutely. And hopefully it empowers them to take charge of their own health.
Knowledge is power. The more you understand about your body and your health, the better equipped you are to make informed decisions.
So if there's one thing we want our listeners to take away from this deep dive, it's this. Stay curious, stay informed, and keep those conversations going with your healthcare providers.
And if you're living with heart failure, don't give up hope. There are incredible advances happening all the time, and the future of treatment is looking brighter than ever.
So well said. Until next time, keep diving deep, everyone.
Thank you for tuning into the Heartbeat Podcast, where we uncover the science behind every beat. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform to stay updated with our latest discussions and insights. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, feedback, or questions, and let's continue exploring the pulse of modern cardiology together. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep your heart healthy.